Really Merit, and welcome to another episode of Meritocracy. Today I'm here with Dr. Adam Domby, who's an award-winning historian of the Civil War era, Reconstruction, and the American South. He's an assistant professor at the College of Charleston, and his new book is just amazing. I finished it several weeks ago, but it's The False Cause: Fraud, Fabrication, and White Supremacy in Confederate Memory, published by the University of Virginia Press. So welcome, Adam.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of all your work. As you mentioned, we've been friends for a while, and I'm just, when I knew the book was coming out, I was like, this is one of the podcasts I want to go on. So thanks for having me.
Oh, great. Well, I know you've been super busy with all of the monuments coming down. You've been all over the place with press. But I just want to give the viewers at home a little bit more about your background. You've written on a variety of different topics, including prisoners of war, guerrilla warfare, and genealogy. You've had multiple current research projects on topics ranging from rabbi con man to divided communities in the aftermath of the Civil War. And one thing that we both share, and is a common thread through a lot of these meritocracy interviews, is you were originally from Atlanta. And so
Yeah.
one of these native white Southerners studying the South, what really got you interested in history and made you decide to become a historian, not just of the South, but the Civil War era?
It's a really good question. So when I went to college many years ago, I went to be a math major, and I was convinced I was going to major in math. And that lasted all of one semester. And so if there are any students out there listening, as I always tell them, you can change your major. And I very quickly realized that I enjoyed the history classes I was taking, but I was just sort of thinking that they were going to be on the side as I figured out what else I would major in. And I took a class with Aaron Sachs, which made me realize that I really loved history. Aaron Sachs is he's now at Cornell. He was a graduate student at the time who was teaching a class on wilderness in the North American imagination. And here I was straight out of high school. And to me, the idea of wilderness, I was like, the woods. That's the wilderness. And I didn't fully comprehend sort of the larger meaning of the term and how it shaped American history until I took his class. I was ignorant of it. And his class really made me realize there's so much I wanted to learn. And I thought, oh, maybe the environmental history or colonial history will be what I do. And then I took David Blight's Civil War class when he came to Yale. It was my second year of college. He arrived and taught this class, and I had my mind blown because things that I had grown up learning were false. And I think in some ways I came back to where I started with this book. And I didn't realize that when I sat down to write it. But I'd grown up and had heard people say, it wasn't just about slavery, or slavery was just the incident, not the cause, or various sort of aspects. I'd grown up watching the movie Gettysburg and thinking of Longstreet and Lee as the heroes of the movie. And, when I would have played with my friends, I thought, oh, I want to be the Confederates. I even had a Confederate Playmobil set, which my parents recently found, and point out the toys for my nephews. My old toys, my nephews were visiting, they found the old Confederate set. And I was like, wow, I really, in some ways, idolized the Confederacy more than the Union, or the United States Army, and I realized that a lot of the reason for that had very little to do with the actual war. And so I came back to this topic, though. I wanted to do Civil War. I grew up on a battlefield, interestingly. I'd always been interested in military history. I loved trips to Gettysburg, but I grew up in Atlanta. I grew up on a battlefield. I grew up a few blocks from where Sherman's headquarters was, and I never realized it until I think I was in grad school that I was so close to his headquarters. I knew it was a battlefield, but so in some ways I came back. When I graduated college, though, I wasn't going to be a professional historian. I was going to be a park ranger. I knew I would never go to grad school. I was just absolutely sure of it. And went off to be a park ranger, was a park ranger for a while, and then went into politics for a change of pace. And while in politics, got really frustrated hearing people say things on the House floor. I had to listen to C-SPAN every day as part of my job. I'd have C-SPAN on, and I'd hear congressmen get up and say just things that I knew to be false historically about the American history. And I thought, we need a better understanding of the past. So I thought I should be a historian. And I still didn't realize that where the false cause was coming from, because I wrote my dissertation on an entirely different topic. I wrote on divided communities in North Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, not a topic that's really directly tied to current issues at the time, I thought, but it very loosely touched on a few aspects of memory that later became important to me. And this book then came out of sort of some things I stumbled upon along the way.
Well,
That's a long way of saying how I got there.
It answers so many questions that I think my book, Masterless Men, kind of left off with. And it really does fill the gap, I think, between the Civil War and Jim Crow as to how this kind of idea of the solid white South that really is the thread that keeps white supremacy held together, right? It's this idea, this shared past as both losers and as heroic, common soldiers who gave their hearts and put everything they had into this noble cause, supposedly. It really answers the question as to, if there were so many deserters, if there were so many draft dodgers, how did we get to this idea of the Civil War, as every white person in the South supported the Confederacy, regardless of whether or not they held slaves, regardless of what part of the South they lived in. And so for folks at home, can you just give them a brief summary of the false cause?
Yeah, and I think you're dead on when you say that they're connected to your work, because it really is this idea of, when people talk about the Confederacy as when I grew up, I thought of the South. When someone said the South, or the Confederacy, I thought the South. The South is the Confederacy. They were synonyms to me growing up, and they're not anymore, because I realized that there are so many, first off, Black Southerners who did not support the Confederacy, but also white Southerners who didn't. But let me explain the book as a whole. The false cause looks at the interplay between white supremacy, historical narratives of the past, specifically mostly centered around the Civil War and Reconstruction, but a little bit about slavery as well, and lies. When we talk about Civil War memory, what we're usually talking about is what's selectively remembered, which on the flip side is always what's selectively forgotten, right? You have what's remembered, you have what's forgotten. And the book brings in a third category that has largely been ignored, in my opinion, by historians, which is what is just made up. This sort of third element largely to paper over stuff that needs to be forgotten. Because sometimes it's not enough to just selectively remember. Sometimes you have to make stuff up when you're trying to shape how we remember the past for specific present needs. I became really fascinated on this issue because what I realized, I had two projects initially that I thought were going to be separate articles. One was on pension fraud. And I had all these cases that I stumbled upon in the archives pretty randomly and then I went looking and found more, of Confederate soldiers who got pensions, and even though they had deserted and technically were ineligible. At the same time, I had this other project going on with Confederate monuments. And this project, I wanted to write about how, monuments were tied to white supremacy in the rhetoric of dedication speeches and the politics of the time, how this narrative of the lost cause was tied to white supremacy. And what I realized these were actually, much like a bad, crime TV show, the two cases were actually one. They were the same story. The lies that allowed pension fraud to occur were also part of what was upholding white supremacy, and that white supremacist narrative was also based on lies. And so what I realized is this is actually one work. And so I put aside my dissertation in 2016 to write it. And it really looks at how Confederate veterans and their allies, to be clear, Confederate veterans and their allies rewrote the war and created a narrative that upheld white supremacy in the Jim Crow era. And it looks specifically at North Carolina as sort of a case study, but it can be applied anywhere. I mean, you can do this research anywhere, but it looks at how a narrative in which there was a solid South was presented, where white Southerners all supported the Confederacy, where white Southerners all had fought valiantly, where all white Southerners were sort of unanimous in the way. They were the greatest soldiers since Thermopylae. It's a very flat picture of the past, right? An unnuanced picture of the past, which is something that both of us have spent our sort of historical careers fighting against, these unnuanced fictions of the past. when in reality, the Confederate soldier was quite diverse in their experiences, their desires, whether they fought, why they fought, if they wanted to really be there or not. Why did this myth get evolved in the first place? And the answer I kept coming back to again and again was that it was actively shaped, frequently purposefully, sometimes accidentally, but it served a purpose each and every time we had these lies. And that purpose was to uphold the biggest lie of them all, white supremacy, the idea that there are superior and inferior people based on the color of their skin.
And so this, of course, then ties your book explicitly to what's going on with monument removal, because it really, your book ties in well with Karen Cox's work, of course, on the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the erection of these monuments, basically during the heyday of Jim Crow, mainly in the 1890s through the early 1900s. I've been framing the issue lately myself as almost even a backlash to populism. And your ideas about North Carolina, I think, is really interesting. Can you give us an idea of under the biracial legislature in North Carolina, was that a huge time of pension frauds? Was it more in the early 1900s?
I think you're right. There is a backlash, and you're right. Karen Cox's book is foundational to my work. I could not have written the first two chapters without. In fact, I kept a copy of her book next to me as I wrote those sections so I could continually reference it, because it is the definitive work on the UDC. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy were key players in working with the veterans, and together they rewrote the past, and they worked together in very gendered ways. But what's really interesting about the Fusion era in North Carolina, for those of you who don't know, of course, is that after Reconstruction, white Democrats, conservatives took control of the state. Then, in the 1890s, a biracial movement combining populism and Republicans, so it was biracial, only ran one candidate for each office at the same time, and were able to take back control of the state government and to actually take the Senate seat for North Carolina and the governorship. And they started instituting reforms. In many ways, it was a pushback against what white Democrats called redemption, right? The end of Reconstruction. And there's almost no Confederate monuments put up during the Fusion era. There's only, I think, 4 that I know of off the top of my head that are put up in front of sort of public areas during that period. One of them is at the state at the state house, though, at the state capitol, which just actually removed. It was pulled down by protesters, and they're now removing the rest of it, is my understanding. What's really interesting about this monument, there's actually a vote held by the legislature, the state legislature, and the Fusionists, the Republicans especially, vote against erecting a Confederate monument. So what's really neat in North Carolina, you have a really good example of the flipping of politics of a party, right? The Republican Party starts off as the party that opposes Confederate monuments, literally, and they're attacked for it again and again by the Democrats afterwards. For the next decade, they're being attacked for not voting for funding. Meanwhile, today, the Republican Party is trying to pass laws to keep people from removing these monuments and are the biggest defenders of these monuments. So you can sort of see that. But at the end of the Fusion era, Fusion ends because they pass a constitutional amendment creating a grandfather clause, which disenfranchises African Americans. During that campaign, one of the other major political issues besides disenfranchising Black people is giving pensions to Confederate veterans. So they are literally tied in the campaign. It's how they try to attract white voters. So they're saying they literally have white supremacy clubs, and their campaign slogans are things like "the white man shall rule or die." You have the Wilmington Massacre. And at the same time as they're saying, we're going to, reassert white supremacy in our politics, we're going to disenfranchise African Americans, the other thing we're going to do is we're going to give Confederate veterans money. And so these are tied together. And the laws changed immediately after disenfranchisement. You have the new legislature come in. It's much more conservative, much whiter. And they vote to make pensions available to Confederate veterans. So they're very much tied in a pushback, and it's used as a political tool. And then it's used as a political tool afterwards to keep people voting. People who might lose their pension otherwise are told, well, if you vote right, we'll let you keep your pension. They're very much tied.
And of course, because so many of these people actually needed a pension, You found some sort of class dynamic here, right?
Oh, there's very much a class dynamic that is really important to recognize, because what you see is that wealthier white Southerners are using pensions as a tool to get votes from poorer white Southerners. And the way they do this is they say, basically, they never question their war service. They just are like, are you actually impoverished? Yes, here's the money. And so you have individuals who literally were born after the war getting Confederate pensions as loyal Confederate soldiers. And you have guys who literally took up arms against the Confederacy who agree. And what's really interesting is it's a way to attract these people who in the 1870s, their family are devout Republicans. And they're willing to, because they're bitter towards the Confederacy. But by 1920, say, they might be willing to say, oh, I'll vote for the Democrat and I'll toe the party line on what happened during the war and I'll claim I was a Confederate because it pays me. And that's more valuable. And so people lie about their wartime service. And what's really interesting is these pension records and the stories that are being told around them, and then the obituaries that are written, help shape how we understand the past, because people go, every time one of these guys dies, the obituary says, oh, Confederate pensioner, he served really loyally, because that's what he'd said, because he needed the pension. And so these guys are remembered. So the next generation is sitting here, and every example of a Confederate soldier they see fought nobly, because there were no deserters, apparently. And so they go on in the next generation, they're not even looking for desertion.
I always get this question whenever I'm talking about the legacy of the Confederacy in talks, is kind of the inverse relationship of places that were heavily Unionist in the South or either anti-Confederate, and places that, are flying the Confederate flag and are have very active roles of sons of Confederate veterans and daughters of the Confederacy. These are the places where they venerate the Confederacy the most, like, in Appalachia, for example.
Yeah, West Virginia, I think, is my favorite example. West Virginia literally formed as an opposition to the Confederacy, and or Central PA. I mean, I think Central PA is a great example. If you've ever been up to Central PA, you see people with Confederate flags all over the place, and you're like, you guys realize the Confederacy not only fought against Pennsylvania, but invaded this very area and kidnapped local residents and sold them into slavery. Right. And you're flying their flag. It's an interesting choice. But yeah, it's because that flag has always been tied to an ideology from its creation.